On the evening of April 20th, 2010, a group of BP executives were on board the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. They had come to congratulate the crew. 7 years without a lost time incident. 7 years of safe operations. They presented awards. They shook hands. They were still on the rig when it started to shake. At 7:45 in the evening, a geyser of seawater erupted from the marine riser and shot 70 feet into the air. It was followed by a surge of drilling mud, methane gas, and water. The gas ignited. The explosion was visible from 40 miles away. 11 workers were killed. 17 were injured. The rig burned for 36 hours before sinking to the ocean floor. It was connected to a well 5,000 feet below the surface. When the rig sank and the riser pipe connecting it to the wellhead broke apart, there was nothing left to stop the oil. For 87 days, oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico. Nearly 5 million barrels, 134 million gallons. The largest accidental marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. Earlier that same day, a critical safety test on the well had failed. Not once, 4 times. The pressure spiked above 1,000 pounds per square inch on every attempt. The engineers looked at the readings. They concluded the test results were caused by something else. They decided the well was safe. They were wrong. And the blowout preventer, the last line of defense against exactly this kind of event, had not been properly inspected since 2005. The Deepwater Horizon was one of the most advanced offshore drilling rigs ever built. Constructed in South Korea in 2000 and won by Hyundai Heavy Industries. Semi-submersible, ultra-deepwater capable, dynamically positioned. 596 feet long. It had drilled the deepest oil well in history in September of 2009, 35,000 feet below the surface of the water. It was owned by Transocean and leased to BP. In February of 2010, it began drilling an exploratory well at the Macondo prospect in the Mississippi Canyon, approximately 41 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The well was located 5,000 feet below the surface of the water and extended nearly 18,000 feet into the rock below the sea floor. It was a difficult well in a difficult location under enormous pressure. By April of 2010, the well was in its final stages of completion. BP was preparing to seal it with cement, remove the drill pipe, and move the rig to a new location. They were behind schedule. The Macondo well had been described by investigators as a problem well from early in the drilling process. There had been complications, lost drilling fluid, unexpected pressure readings. Internal BP documents showed engineers had raised concerns as early as 2009 about the metal casing they planned to use, worrying it might collapse under high pressure. Those concerns were noted. The drilling continued. In the final days before the explosion, a series of decisions were made on the Deepwater Horizon that investigators later identified as the chain that led to the disaster. The cement job. Halliburton had been contracted to cement the well casing. The cement was designed to seal the well and prevent oil and gas from flowing up toward the surface. A test called an acoustic log could verify whether the cement had been placed correctly by checking for air gaps. The acoustic log test was not run. It would have cost $128,000. It would have taken no more than 12 hours. It was skipped. The negative pressure test. Before removing the heavy drilling mud from the well, mud that helped counteract the upward pressure of the oil and gas below, engineers were required to conduct a negative pressure test. This test verified that the well was sealed and that there was no flow of hydrocarbons coming up from below. On the afternoon of April 20th, the negative pressure test was conducted. The pressure in the well spiked to over 1,200 pounds per square inch. The test was run again. Over 1,200 again. Run again. Over 1,200 again. Run a fourth time. Over 1,200 again. A pressure reading of 1,200 pounds per square inch was a clear signal that fluids were moving into the well from the surrounding rock. It meant the cement job had failed. It meant the well was not sealed. The engineers looked at the readings. They proposed an alternative explanation. They suggested that the dense drilling mud above the seal was creating pressure on the instrument, a phenomenon they called the bladder effect. This explanation was incorrect. It was not supported by established engineering practice, but it was an explanation that allowed the work to continue. The negative pressure test was declared satisfactory. The heavy drilling mud began to be replaced with lighter seawater. Without the mud's counterbalancing weight, nothing was left to hold back the oil and gas below. At 7:45 in the evening on April 20th, a geyser of seawater erupted from the marine riser onto the rig floor. It shot 70 feet into the air. It was followed immediately by a surge of drilling mud and methane gas. The mud splattered across the rig. The gas component, lighter than mud, separated and accelerated upward. It reached the rig's ventilation system. It was drawn into the engine rooms. In the engine rooms, the gas ignited. The first explosion blew across the drill floor and into the living quarters. Workers who had been asleep in their cabins were thrown from their beds. The rig's safety systems activated. The blowout preventer, a massive device on the seafloor designed as the final safeguard against exactly this scenario, was activated. It failed. A secondary component called a blind shear ram, designed to cut through the drill pipe and seal the well, also failed. The rig was on fire. 11 workers were dead. 94 crew members escaped by lifeboat or helicopter. The fire burned for 36 hours. Fireboats could not extinguish it. On the morning of April 22nd, the Deepwater Horizon sank. The riser pipe connecting the rig to the wellhead 5,000 feet below broke apart. Oil began flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, completely uncontrolled. The Coast Guard was not notified immediately. In the hours after the explosion, the scale of what was happening below the surface was not yet understood. On April 23rd, a remotely operated vehicle investigated the wellhead and found no oil leaking. The Coast Guard expressed cautious optimism. The next day they announced that a damaged wellhead was indeed leaking. They described it as a very serious spill. BP's initial estimate was that approximately 1,000 barrels per day were leaking. That estimate was wrong. By multiple subsequent analyses, the well was leaking at its peak more than 60,000 barrels per day. BP's number was off by a factor of 60. Over the 87 days the well remained open, nearly 5 million barrels of oil entered the Gulf of Mexico. BP attempted multiple interventions. A containment dome, a top-kill procedure designed to pump drilling mud into the well to stop the flow. A junk shot, pumping golf balls, rope, and other materials into the blowout preventer to clog it. All of them failed or achieved only partial containment. On July 15, 2010, a capping stack was installed and the flow of oil was stopped. On September 19th, a relief well intersected the original well and it was permanently sealed. 87 days after the explosion. The damage to the Gulf of Mexico was unlike anything the United States had experienced in peacetime. 11,000 miles of coastline were affected. Fishing grounds were closed across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Marine ecosystems from the deep sea floor to the surface were contaminated. The economic damage to fishing and tourism industries along the Gulf Coast was estimated in the billions. BP stock lost 55% of its value in the weeks following the explosion, a reduction of $67 billion in market capitalization. The investigation that followed found something that investigators of industrial disasters had seen before. Not one company responsible. 3 companies, and each of them pointing at the others. BP was the well operator. It had made the decisions about the cement job, the acoustic log test, and the negative pressure test. Transocean owned the rig and operated it. Its crew had failed to recognize the warning signs in the hours before the explosion. Over a 40-minute period during which hydrocarbons were flowing into the well, the Transocean crew had not identified what was happening. Halliburton had performed the cement job that investigators concluded had failed. BP placed most of the blame on Transocean and Halliburton. Transocean and Halliburton placed most of the blame on BP. The Presidential Commission, appointed to investigate the disaster, found that there was not a culture of safety on that rig. It found a rush to completion that had overridden safety considerations at multiple decision points. It found that workers understood they could be fired for raising safety concerns that might delay drilling. Internal BP documents revealed that this was not a secret understanding. It was a documented culture. Criminal charges eventually followed. In 2012, BP pleaded guilty to 14 criminal charges, including 11 counts of felony manslaughter, 1 for each worker killed. BP agreed to pay $4.5 billion in criminal penalties. In settlements for civil and natural resource damage claims, BP ultimately paid more than $65 billion. No individual BP executive was ever sent to prison. The blowout preventer that failed had not been properly inspected since 2005. 5 years before the explosion. The last line of defense against the largest oil spill in American history had not been checked in 5 years. On April 20, 2010, 11 men went to work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. Jason Anderson, Aaron Burkeen, Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, Gordon Jones, Roy Kemp, Carl Kleppinger, Blair Manuel, Dewey Rivette, Shane Rochto, Adam Wise. They ranged in age from 22 to 56. They were roughnecks and engineers and crane operators. They were husbands and fathers and sons. They were on the rig that night because the oil industry had decided that the Gulf of Mexico was where the oil was and someone had to go get it. Earlier that day, a critical safety test had failed 4 consecutive times. The engineers looked at the numbers. They found a way to interpret the numbers that allowed the work to continue. They were wrong. The blowout preventer that should have saved the rig had not been inspected in 5 years. It failed. The 11 men who were close to the explosion when it happened were never found. The oil flowed for 87 days. BP paid $65 billion in settlements. No one went to prison. The Gulf of Mexico is still recovering. Do you think BP paid a fair price for what happened, or did the people responsible escape accountability? Tell me below.